confounds it because now all of a sudden the United States has to worry about having the same thing happen to places like Belgium and Germany have had to worry about forever. But the U.S. isn't going to get invaded in the old-fashioned sense, but what's the difference if eventually some other power can just ignore the fact you have a couple of and turn your cities into smoking heaps of rubble? The United States hadn't faced anything comparable to this since the British burned the Capitol building in the War of 1812. Psychologically, it would affect any power. The United States, though, with this extra sense of invulnerability it's always had, was in a unique place in its history. Now, the other side becoming a nuclear power does a couple of things. First of all, it closes the circle in terms of creating the dynamic that we have lived with ever since. This dynamic of both sides being able to do incredible amounts of damage to each other, at least theoretically. Very different dynamic than only one side being able to do that. The other thing that happens in a geopolitical sense is the era of the United States having that MasterCard, as the Secretary of Defense had said, the Royal Straight Flush, that's over with. The window of opportunity, as another advisor had said, this period when the U.S. was the only nuclear power, that's over with too. And predictably, the question of how to respond ran the gamut, with even sober humanitarian type scientists trying to figure out if all of a sudden the balance of rational thought had swung towards the idea of, well, now that they are a nuclear power, we should nuke them while we can. In his book Prisoner's Dilemma, author William Poundstone quotes Harry Truman's science advisor, a guy named William Golden, who penned a letter where he tried to imagine how a man from Mars might view the geopolitical situation. In other words, somebody who didn't have any human skin in the game, just from a purely dispassionate outside observer's viewpoint. And he wrote about the Soviets having the bomb now and the way that the U.S. and the rest of the West should respond. He said, quote, "This brings up the matter of immediate use or threat of use of our weapons. Let us not delude ourselves. To bring about a true international control agreement with Russia, we would have to use them. The consequences would be dreadful indeed, even though I assume that the Russians have so few A-bombs now that they could do little or no damage to the USA, even if they could put them on target. In theory, we should issue an ultimatum and use the bombs against Russia now. For from here on, we inevitably lose ground. And this is true no matter at how much greater a rate we produce, no matter how much more potent weapons. For once Russia is in a position to put A-bombs on our cities, no matter how inefficient those bombs may be, and how few in number, she is in a position to do us unspeakable injury. That we can retaliate 100-fold, or wipe out every Russian, will not repair the damage. So a good, though a moral case can be made by the disinterested man from Mars for our shooting at once." End quote. He then goes on to say, however, we won't do it, of course, no matter what the alternative, because the public would never support it. The last comment is fascinating again, because you're again tempted to see it as some sort of an ethical evolutionary change. I mean, would the ancient Bronze Age civilizations have hesitated a minute? I don't know. Of course, if one wanted to look at it in a more cynical way, maybe you'd just say, no one wants to be living on what will turn into a nuclear battlefield if such a war breaks out, so when your country talks about starting one, or being the first to introduce such a weapon, I think maybe there's just a survival instinct that kicks in, and maybe the people from the Bronze Age would have understood that perfectly. But we come to another one of those moments now, a fork in the road, a decision between maybe what you could call doing things the way we always have for all the right reasons, and acting in a way that would sort of defy your expectations, given human history. And it's, what do you do now? What do you do if you're the United States and you've just had your atomic monopoly destroyed? Human nature and all of human history would say you try to go get another monopoly. You continue work right? You develop the next system. You regain dominance and superiority in that field. Nobody wants to be the one who's the last person to invent a machine gun or something like that. You could lose a war that way. The last nation to get an air force, right? But if you are already struggling to try to figure out how to handle, not having catastrophe strike in a world of atomic weapons, how sort of against the grain from an Einstein or an Oppenheimer viewpoint does it sound to talk about making a super weapon?
Also for
the super was actually the nickname for the next level in human weaponry development that was already theorized and the work had already begun on. A weapon that would make the atomic bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki look like nothing. Weapons that required a bomb like the bomb used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki as a primer for its main explosion. A guy named Edward Teller is most famous for association with what will be the weapon that makes atomic bombs obsolete. A guy like J. Robert Oppenheimer, who one of Truman's aides said was too much of a poet and not enough of a hard-headed realist. But the kind of bomb that a guy like J. Robert Oppenheimer would say is farther than we should go. We should no longer develop more powerful weapons than the ones we have. But think about how much that runs against the grain of human behavior. Could we, if faced with extinction, decide to cap weapons research and development? We will never discover anything more powerful or deadly than this. How do you shut off information like that? How do you keep someone else from developing it? These are the age-old problems that humanity's always had to deal with. And right after the Soviets demonstrate that they too are now an atomic power, Harry Truman has to wrestle once again with all sorts of forces and uncertainties, and he's in a brand new era of human history with no roadmap. This is a guy, by the way, who had been vice president for like 5 minutes when Franklin Roosevelt died, and who had cried saying he wasn't up to the job. He's dropped 2 nuclear weapons on Japan, ended the Second World War in effect, and now he's called upon to face these kind of pressures. It's crazy. One can only, whether you think he did a good job or not, have some sympathy for the haberdasher from Missouri, which is what this guy was, the artillery captain from the First World War. Truman is not one of the great minds of history, one of the Marcus Aurelius-type leaders. He's just a pretty normal human being put in a situation where he literally is making decisions about whether or not we can build stuff to destroy the world with, and whether or not that's a good decision. After the Soviets blow up their first A-bomb, Truman asks for some help and some advisors, and he gets the wise men together. It's not exactly philosopher kings, but it is the physicists who invented the first weapon. A bunch of them anyway, led by the guy Truman's aide thought was too much of a poet, J. Robert Oppenheimer, obviously quoting text from the Bhagavad Gita, so maybe there's a point there. Nonetheless, puts him in a room in October 1949, says, should we develop the next level of weaponry above atomic weapons? And is it possible? And if we did it, would it help? And do we need a Manhattan program for the next super weapon, the one that makes our current super weapon obsolete? And the physicists went in a room, talked about this, and issued a report. And the report by the physicists said, don't build this weapon. This weapon, by the way, is something today we call a thermonuclear bomb, or a thermonuclear warhead, a hydrogen bomb. Thousands of times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and described by nuclear expert Joseph Cirincione as the equivalent of bringing a literal piece of the sun down onto Earth. There is no upper limit to their power. In the report, Oppenheimer and friends essentially now 5 years after the atomic bomb was dropped, have a chance to see how humanity's dealing with it, and they've decided maybe, in reading between the lines here, that we haven't evolved enough yet for something like the hydrogen bomb. The report says, quote, "We believe a super bomb should never be produced. Mankind would be far better off not to have a demonstration of the feasibility of such a weapon until the present climate of world opinion changes." End quote. Is that code for until we evolve more? They also seem to be suggesting that this is a chance to provide an example on how we can break the patterns of the past because we have to survive. They write, quote, "In determining not to proceed to develop the super bomb, we see a unique opportunity of providing by example some limitations on the totality of war, and thus limiting the fear and arousing the hopes of mankind." End quote. There's that poet, Oppenheimer and his rainbow and unicorns coming out again, the people around Truman might say. The great Enrico Fermi and another physicist penned an even more apocalyptic response. They didn't think that the one that I just read to you goes far enough. They wrote this, and I'll quote it in its entirety because it is shocking. They are basically saying, you are inventing weapons that can now do the equivalent of creating giant natural catastrophes. If you could turn on, for example, the ability to cause a massive tsunami or something. Fermi and his colleague write, quote, "A decision on the proposal that an all-out effort be undertaken for the development of the super cannot, in our opinion, be separated from considerations of broad national policy. A weapon like the super is only an advantage when its energy release is from 100 to 1,000 times greater than that of ordinary atomic bombs. The area of destruction, therefore, would run from 150 to approximately 1,000 square miles or more. Necessarily, such a weapon goes far beyond any military objective and enters the range of very great natural catastrophes. By its very nature, it cannot be confined to a military objective, but becomes a weapon which in practical effect is almost one of genocide. It is clear that the use of such a weapon cannot be justified on any ethical ground, which gives a human being a certain individuality and dignity, even if he happens to be a resident of an enemy country. It is evident to us that this would be the view of peoples in other countries. Its use would put the United States in a bad moral position relative to the peoples of the world. Any post-war situation resulting from such a weapon would leave unresolvable enmities for generations. A desirable peace cannot come from such an inhuman application of force. The post-war problems would dwarf the problems which confront us at present." End quote. That's pretty harsh, and you can say to yourself, well, some of these physicists live in their own unreal world. But David Lilienthal from the Atomic Energy Commission, one of the people who pushed back against the idea of using atomic bombs during the Berlin airlift, wrote in his diary about the way the government was leaning, and it was not in the direction the physicists wanted when he said, quote, "More and better bombs. Where will this lead is difficult to see. We keep saying we have no other course. What we should say is we're not bright enough to see any other course." End quote. So you run into the people that give you the old Machiavellian reality, which is we've got to build these bombs because the other side's going to build them too. And the last thing you want to do is be the last person to own the next level of weaponry, which makes total sense given our history. What the physicists are telling us is that everything you learned in your history, everything that's been pasted onto your DNA from thousands of years of human evolution since cities first cropped up is obsolete. And you can either change that standard template, by which you gauge what you should do in any given situation, or you can find yourself a victim of a weapon that makes an atomic bomb look like a conventional bomb. Truman, as usual, had many more pressures weighing on him. David Lilienthal in his diary also records a statement by Senator Brian McMahon, who describes sort of the mood that the American people would have if they found out that the Russians had an H-bomb, But the United States didn't. He said, quote, "Why, a president who didn't approve going ahead on the H-bomb all out would be hanged from a lamppost if the Russians should get it and we hadn't." End quote. Kind of hard to argue with that logic, isn't it? It's the same logic we'd operate with today. And it's hard not to be struck here, isn't it, when you consider this strange divide between the level of the intelligence of the people that were put together to create these super weapons versus the level of intelligence of the people whose decision it will be whether or not to use them. The political class in these democracies and republics, for example, but let's remember, as that statement by that senator points out, how heavily influenced they are by public opinion. If we're living on a knife edge over how these weapons are used and how wise we can be about them, do you really want that decision devolving down to the average Joe and Jane level? The counter-proposal, by the way, by physicists like Oppenheimer over why you don't need to build this super weapon is that you've reached a maximum threshold when it comes to the power of these weapons to do anything. They offer the idea that you can just use atomic bombs to deter anyone who's got any weapon greater, because you don't need anything bigger than that. They may say, we'll drop a hydrogen bomb on your city that's 1,000 times more powerful than your puny A-bomb. Yes, but the puny A-bomb still basically takes out the city. You're trading cities for cities, and what Oppenheimer and those guys were saying is that once you lose a city in this deal, and once you're trading city for city, you have the deterrent value you need to stop somebody else from attacking you with any kind of weapon. This is the beginning of the ideas of nuclear deterrence. You begin to see the introduction into this debate of a civilian class of intellectuals who become sort of the alternative to the rainbow and unicorn poets like Oppenheimer's approach, where they want us to become different people than we've always been. The other side of that coin is these people who would say, we're not going to change, and it's too hard to change, and the system isn't flexible enough even if we wanted to change, so we're going to have to learn how to live with these weapons as intelligently as we can. And big civilian thinkers started to meet with each other, starting in about 1945, right after the first A-bombs were dropped at the end of the Second World War. And they began to coalesce in groups and meetings at major universities, places like Yale, for example. And these experts would come from a wide range of disciplines: social scientists, political scientists, physicists, of course, but also people like the civilian leaders of agencies. David Lilienthal from the Atomic Energy Commission was there. And they would debate these fundamental questions that simply had to be answered in this new era. I mean, first of all, could you use these weapons? If you used them, did that make ground war and tanks and armies obsolete? What would World War III be like? All kinds of fundamental questions. Now, the problem for these people is that all of this stuff is part of what you normally consider to be the responsibility and the prerogative of the military leaders. You don't tell the general how to use his weapons. That's not your business. You tell me where to go and what to do in terms of winning, I'll take care of it. But now the weapons were so powerful that many of the big thinkers out there argued that simply using them had huge political implications. Something you could not delegate to a general on the ground who might think he needed atomic weapons to blow up the entrenchments on that enemy hill, not realizing that he could lose the entire war of global public opinion by doing so, right? In other words, the use of this most powerful weapon had to be in the hands of the supreme leader, whomever that might be. Well, in 1950, that's still Harry Truman, by the way. And in January 1950, after reading the report from Oppenheimer and his fellow scientists saying, don't build the super bomb, Truman decides to build the super bomb. The reasons given, and the people around him have given the reason, they all revolve around the same thing. Again, easily understandable stuff. You can't be outgunned. Truman even mentioned the psychology of it. I mean, even if you believed the idea that Oppenheimer floated, that you can just use A-bombs against their H-bombs, the psychological effect on the American people was unacceptable. So it was a standard, understandable response. They're going to get it, so we have to have it. And the way you can kind of reliably test to see if this is something that, if there was such a thing as collective human DNA, for the species as a whole, that it's in there somewhere. Can you imagine humankind saying no to a more powerful weapon system? I'm sure there's groups on the planet that's very peaceful with the people in that part of the world. They would say no. But as a whole, when you think of the powers at the very height of, importance, can you imagine them saying, yes, we know that's a much bigger and more powerful weapon than we have, but we're okay with what we currently possess. We don't need that bigger weapon. If the aliens landed tomorrow and we found out the biggest weapon they had, destroy the galaxy in the blink of an eye, was the X-14. There are going to be people on this planet right away that say we have to have an X-14. They'll walk all over us if we don't have one, even if we don't know how to use it, even if it might destroy the galaxy. As long as we have one, they can't just roll all over. They have to take it into account, right? We become a player. We will not be subject to escalation dominance. Psychologically, it's important for those aliens to know we have an X-14 too. Here's the thing, though. The Truman administration, at the time that he approves going ahead with this hydrogen bomb, still hasn't figured out how to use the great power of the atomic bomb. They're still trying to figure out what you do with that because it's so powerful, and yet now we're going to move ahead with something that's hundreds of times more powerful than that. Truman has taken the pistol out of the hands of that 5-year-old who was trying to figure out what you do with that and handed him a machine gun instead. He still doesn't know what to do with it, but at least it's a lot more powerful. And that's kind of where we are, because in this period between 1945 and 1950, when it's this theoretical period punctuated by lots of scares and near misses and threats and all that, people are trying to figure out what you can really do with these things. Oppenheimer and his folk had said you don't need anything bigger than an atomic bomb. The problem is during this time period, there is no chance to do what will later be called counterforce, really. Counterforce means using your nuclear weapons against the enemy's military targets. At this stage of development, you are lucky to use them against anything. You use them against big things, cities, with people. These are city-destroying weapons, and that's what you use them for in this period. The question, though, that more political minds are asking during this period is, does that get us what we want? If the thought is that you're going to kill millions and millions of people, do you end up with an outcome, in the end, that was better than what you had before? And then, of course, a really important question during the entire period of the Cold War, and even up to now, is does the other side really think you do that? Remember, there are really, during this period, two kinds of people when it comes to nuclear weapons. The kind who thinks you can use these things and plan to, and the kind who thinks you can't use them. But even those people think that they still make up a part of what you can use to threaten other people. The best use of this tool, as many theorists during this period thought about it anyway, was that it created something where you could tell someone else, do that or else, or don't do that or else you'll get nuked. Remember, Truman did this several times after the Second World War and before 1950. But in April 1950, Truman is presented with a document that will become one of the most important and yet very little known, actually, documents in American history. It's called NSC-68, and it did a lot of things, including pushed forward some of the hydrogen bomb development stuff. But what NSC-68 did in paragraph after paragraph is spot the holes in this entire defense strategy. The fact that you basically were relying on a threat, and if the threat were called, you either had to nuke the other side and kill millions of people, or back down. Well, other powers could test that. They could try to find a point underneath the threshold of when you would use these weapons. What if somebody just sort of gobbled up their neighbor a little at a time? When do you nuke them? Allies guys were worried about this too, because they were starting to think that maybe the United States would be willing to use nuclear weapons themselves in their own protection, but if it was somebody in Europe that they said they'd protect, maybe they don't nuke anyone for that. Maybe they don't kill millions and millions and millions of Russians if the Russians invade West Germany. That kind of thing would make the West Germans nervous, for example. One of the things NSC 68 said is that the risk that they were running right now with their strategy of nuke everything or nothing was, quote, the risk was having no better choice than to capitulate or precipitate a global war, end quote. In other words, they had no flexibility at all. It was nukes or nothing. So NSC 68 becomes this document that advocates a huge increase back to spending on conventional weapons, tanks, planes, naval ships, all the other stuff, but doesn't back off the nuclear stuff either. In other words, whereas before the budgetary choice was between this or that, now it's this and that and everything more. This becomes the document that begins the giant military buildup in the U.S. in the role as sort of the policeman of the free world that we still live with today. Now, initially, Truman looked at this thing, and we are told by the history books thought this was going to be horribly expensive, and Truman tended to be fiscally conservative, and he sort of put it on hold and thought about it a little bit, and then in June, on the 25th, actually, 1950, the North Korean communists invaded South Korea. And what that meant was that all of a sudden, and moving very quickly, and hard to get your mind around, and react and debate and deliberate, what had initially seemed like it was too much money to spend for Truman, and probably Congress and the American people. I think it was something like a virtual tripling of the U.S. defense expenditures. Seemed like a no-brainer. Now that all of a sudden, from all intents and purposes, as far as anyone could tell with quickly moving events, the fuse for the Third World War seemed to have been lit. The Korean War, as it's come to be known, is so fascinating and has so many things involved with it that have nothing to do with the great powers. They would make a wonderful discussion all by itself. I'm going to really resist going off into too many tangents and try to stay on the focus, which is that it's a completely different sort of challenge than trying to live with these amazingly powerful weapons and the temptation and the fear and the uncertainty that they bring to the table, this new thing in peacetime, even with all the threats and the scares. It's an entirely different matter to try to deal with the temptation and fear and uncertainty involving them in wartime. And let's also remember the very other human elements involved that are operating sort of underneath the scenes here. There are a lot of people who have invested reputations and viewpoints and all sorts of things into the efficacy of these weapons and what you can do with them and what sort of game changers they are. And so now we were going to find out, whether they were right. Were all these pronouncements and positions taken in peacetime going to play out the way the advocates and opponents thought they were going to play out now that we have a real live fire situation going on? And if there was ever a conflict that would tempt a leader to use atomic weapons, the Korean War seems tailor-made for it. Because eventually it will settle down to an almost First World War style, very little movement kind of stalemate. But initially it is an absolute bar brawl where the momentum swings wildly from side to side, and there's crises after crises, and each side gets into their own trouble. Initially, the North Korean communist forces, with tanks and people that had fought in the Chinese Civil War, just swarm down and start smashing the South Korean forces, driving them south towards the water. This is going to be a Dunkirk with no place to go, if you catch my meaning. They outnumber them. They have armor. There's a whole bunch of reasons why it happened. Now, Korea had been just sort of getting the idea of independence down after being occupied by Japan. At the end of the Second World War, the Soviets, occupied the top half of the country, basically. The West, the bottom half of the country. They put in governments that they were friendly with, the communist one in the north and the non-communist one in the south. And then kind of, sort of, looked elsewhere while the whole Berlin thing is playing out. I mean, there's bigger fish to fry. As a matter of fact, when the Korean War breaks out, there's a large contingent of people that thinks that this is just a diversionary feint. Sure, old Joe Stalin does a little move in Korea, the entire free world, moves their military forces there, we get bogged down, and then he invades in Europe. A lot of people thought that. The historian John Lewis Gaddis makes a very interesting point, saying that if this hadn't been a World War II style attack with tanks and the whole thing going over the border, basically an open and overt challenge to the post-war idea that we're going to have collective defense and there's never going to be another Hitler and aggressive war is never going to win again, Gaddis says that this attack had been more like the way the Vietnamese were very good at attacking 15 years after this, where they would send in guerrillas and it would be subversive and slow and infiltration, and you never know where the decision points are, that the Americans probably wouldn't have gotten involved at all. But this was a challenge, and somebody had to stand up to it, or at least that's the way it looked to Truman, who was just in the major stages of codifying one of the policies he's most known for instigating, something called containment. There were several different views on how you handle the spread of communism from the domino effect. The one that was eventually part of NSC 68 was called containment. Don't let it spread any farther. There were other more aggressive ones, like rollback, or another one that liberation was what some of the far-right hawks wanted. But containment is what sort of became the policy of the United States. And if that's going to be your policy, even if you thought that just meant you were going to get money and aid and help certain governments, now you had a situation on your hands where if you didn't act and you didn't act soon, South Korea was going to disappear and it was going to be a fait accompli. It wasn't going to matter what you said. There wasn't going to be two Koreas anymore. You weren't going to be able to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. In like 3 days, the capital of South Korea falls. What are you going to do? There were so many other things we have to remember were ongoing at this time, the importance of which has faded in the 70 years since. But remember, this is 5 years after the Second World War. These people had begun to think that they had made war illegal, for lack of a better word. They had once again built structures, what they thought were new and improved structures over the last World War structures. The League of Nations proved to be a toothless tiger, so now we had a new and improved version of it called the United Nations, and this is a real test for the United Nations. Truman involves them, basically right away. They start debating what to do, and as fate would have it, and it never went this way again, the Soviet Union happened to be boycotting the UN at the time, so they were not there. Now, as we all know today, what we would have expected to happen, given our understanding of history, was that when this question of what should we all do about this Korean War thing came to the UN, the Soviet Union, as friends and backers and fellow communists with the North Koreans, would have used their veto, which several members of the UN are on the Security Council permanently and have a veto that they can use and often do. The Soviet Union would have vetoed the whole thing, and everything would have been muddled, and there wouldn't have been any unified effort. But because they happened to be boycotting at the time, they couldn't do that. And the U.S., with a bunch of other nations, got an agreement together to go in and say to South Korea quickly, and the U.S. and other countries became really a United Nations army, at least in terms of the marketing. I mean, it was a United Nations flag that flew on some of these tanks. It's never been quite this way again. The implication was that all of a sudden you were going to have a global world army that could go in and do things like this. In addition, Truman puts in charge one of the heroes of the Second World War, Douglas MacArthur, right? The guy who so famously in the Pacific said, "I shall return," and then eventually he comes back and he goes, "I have returned." I mean, he's Eisenhower famously said he studied dramatics for years as a subordinate to MacArthur. So MacArthur's put in charge of these forces. They're rushed over from Japan. These are a bunch of guys who've been sitting in Japan enjoying themselves for a few years. They're not exactly crack combat troops when they get there, and there's not many of them. And the Air Force comes in and the Navy gets involved, and very quickly you find out that Defense Secretary Louis A. Johnson that said, "We'll never need another amphibious operation. You don't need a Navy," was about as wrong as you could be, because when the Korean War broke out, and within 5 days the United States is trying to be there on the ground to save South Korea from falling, and they just don't have what they need, straight up. when they get in there, and now it looks like they're going to get defeated with the South Koreans. It's just a terrible situation. It becomes the first moment where you think, God, if you had some really good tactical nuclear weapons during this period, you can see some places where you'd just love to use them, but they don't have that right now. But over and over again, the situation will change. Eventually, there'll be enough forces built up so the UN forces can start pushing back and creating a larger perimeter, and then MacArthur, and maybe the greatest move of his career, lands an amphibious operation in your face, Louis A. Johnson, at Incheon behind the North Korean lines, cuts them off, begins to push back up now towards North Korea. So we've gone from defending South Korea to now moving in and invading North Korea, and there are warnings, be careful, you're approaching China, they might not like that. Even though MacArthur is supposedly finding Chinese dead people when he goes over and looks at what should be North Korean dead people, he tells President Truman, don't worry, the Chinese aren't going to get involved. And secretly later on you find out he's not scared of them anyway. So they don't have the logistics, what are they going to do, blah, 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 nothing's going to happen. And he continues to move forces closer to their line, and then they whack him with like 200,000, 300,000 guys. Boom. The war changes again, and now the Chinese have entered the conflict. Think of how quickly this escalated from a North Korean, South Korean affair to something where you now had the United States of America and a multitude of its Western allies, the great powers of the West, facing off against Red China on the Asian mainland, backed by the Soviet Union. We started this on June 25th, 1950. Within a couple of days, the U.S. and the West are involved. By September, you have the Incheon landings, and the whole complexion of the war changes. By late October, early November, the Chinese are in it. But not officially. Then that becomes part of where you begin to see this evolving into a very post-Second World War form. A form that is largely dictated by the existence and possible use of nuclear weapons. This is when it becomes apparent that to keep this from becoming World War III, all the major powers that would be needed to fight World War III are doing their best to create some plausible deniability so that nobody has to admit this is World War III. I mean, one of the interesting theories out there is that if you don't have nuclear weapons in the world during this time period, maybe there's a decent chance this does turn into World War III. But you can watch Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, Mao in Red China, and Harry Truman all bending over backwards to be able to tell the world, no, this isn't war. In Truman's case, famously, when the fighting breaks out and it's the worst since the Second World War, pretty hard to deny what's going on there, isn't war. And the reporter says to the president, he says, President Truman, is this war? Are we at war? And Truman famously says right there, no, we are not at war. And so the reporter counters with something like, so what is this? Is this like a police action? And Truman famously says something to the effect of, yeah, that about sums it up. And forever after, it's been called the police action. As though the proper label on this thing puts a limit on it. It's not just about marketing either. There are real changes. I mean, if Truman calls this anything besides a war, does he have to go to Congress and ask them to declare war? This is another thing that a bunch of modern historians are suggesting was seen by the people around Truman as kind of a quaint relic of a pre-nuclear age. His Secretary of State and people like that, not huge fans of more people being in on the decision-making process, and Truman was able to put troops in harm's way without ever having to ask anyone else's permission. Historian Gary Will said the decision to intervene in Korea was made amongst Truman and a tiny group of advisors around himself. The reporter asked that question about, are we at war? Because normally you would know there'd be a big declaration, Congress would do it, the country'd be all in, they'd ramp up for the war effort, they'd use everything in their power, they'd demolish the other side, and they'd come home. But can you do that in a nuclear age? The reason the Korean War is germane to this story is because, well, here's the way historian John Lewis Gaddis explains it, quote, The outbreak of fighting in Korea in June 1950 provided the first hard evidence. The Korean War demonstrated how awkward it would be to use atomic bombs, even in the most desperate military circumstances. From this perspective, they proved to be irrelevant to the outcome of that conflict. But from another perspective, they were of critical importance, for Korea determined how hot wars during the Cold War were to be fought. The rule quickly became that neither the United States nor the Soviet Union would confront the other directly or use all available force. Each would seek instead to confine such confrontation within the theaters in which they had originated. This pattern of tacit cooperation amongst bitter antagonists